you will only be seen or heard if you speak. And so hopefully that's okay with you, but just knowing that this meeting will be recorded. As we continue on today, again, Abby mentioned that this is all about small groups, and we do have lots of other sessions coming up around literacy as well. But just so you know that this presentation aligns with the APS 5 pillars, New Mexico MLSS, which we'll talk a little bit about today, the New Mexico Literacy Framework, as well as Eclipse and national boards. So if you are looking for some alignment, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to start with those typical virtual norms that you always hear. Please stay muted unless speaking. Cameras are definitely your choice. And always ask questions in the chat, or feel free to even just unmute yourselves. We want to make sure that you leave today feeling really comfortable in small groups. Our agenda for today is going to be talking about small groups and how they can support students' independence. We'll dive a little bit into differentiation and how to use SMART goals to create learning objectives, some activities that then match those differentiated learning goals, and then the steps to get started with this in your classroom today. All that being said, we're going to start with the idea of small groups. What is a small group? How do you start a small group? All of the fun stuff related to small groups. Now remember that small groups can often also be times called flexible groups, and that these can be all different things, right? These can be partners, just me and one other person working together. These can be a small group of students, 3 to 5 students, or this could be up to possibly 6 students with a larger group. The idea is that flexible groups are just not the entire class doing the same thing. So these can also be made up of different abilities, as well as an opportunity to work with the people with the same abilities. And so flexible groups are just that. And they also move throughout the day. So you might be in one group of a partner with the same ability, and next you might be in a small group with varying abilities. And so keeping those groups flexible. Also, flexible groups can be led by a teacher or led by students. They can be assigned or oftentimes even self-selected, allowing some choice for your students. And the last thing is that sometimes these small groups can last weeks, depending on the purpose of the activity. Sometimes they can only last the day or the specific task at hand. So really understanding why you're putting students into small groups is going to really help determine the length, the grouping number, and the work that students will be doing in their small group. So always remembering, why are my students in a small group today, is really going to help you to determine those. A suggestion for K through 3 students based off of the NMPED website, this is for the MLSS group, is that students have opportunities to receive layer 2 intervention as well as layer 1 classroom intervention using small groups. And so here are some of the recommendations for small group instruction. This allows instruction to be active and proactive for our students, where we can intervene as well as support extended learning. And so you can see that in layer 1, it can be anything between 1 and 13 students. This gives students an opportunity to work in small groups all day with grade level content. For layer 2, these are for students that might be somewhat below grade level. They're asking for groups to be no larger than 9. This should also last 30 minutes a day, making sure that students are getting targeted intervention. And then that layer 3, these are students that are well below our grade level, that you should only have 3 to 5 students in these small groups, and this should last 30 to 60 minutes per day in this small group. So these are just recommendations off of the PED MLSS website. That link is also in the notes for you here, so that you can start to see, again, we talked about different times throughout the day where students are in different sizes of groups and possibly even lasting different times. And so these are just some of the suggestions that come from that website. The The objective of working in small groups is making sure that students receive what they need when they need it and how they need it. And so, to get started with small groups, consider an assessment. These assessments can be wide and varied. These can be classroom made assessments, observational data, or standardized assessments. As you assess your students, that will help to determine the group that they're in, why they're in that group, and what the targeted instruction is going to be in that group. So once you assess, then you group your students. Once you have that group of students identified, that's where you'll start to create that goal. What will they accomplish during that time in their small group? And then what will those targeted lessons be that they're going to do to help them reach that goal? Once they're in that group, again, that can be from one day up to a couple weeks. Then you're going to reassess, hopefully have met that goal, to regroup, create new goals, and create new lessons. So this cycle, if you will, is kind of that cycle that's going to help us best match our students with their needs, with their instructional needs, and with their outcomes. And so hopefully that assess, group, lesson cycle can become part of what you do every day, helping your flexible groups be the most successful. And adding to that, the things that do make small group the most successful are the process and the routine, recognizing that no small group is going to work without explicit instruction of how to work in a small group, especially this year, coming back after a year of students being quite independent as learners, really creating that process and routine of why they're in that small group, how to function in the small group, what are possibly the jobs and responsibilities, what are the outcomes that you hope that they have, how do they transition in and out of those groups, how do they get materials. All of those processes and routines are very important to making your small groups successful. I would suggest even allowing that process and routine be the small group outcome the first couple times that you try to do small groups. Just let them get the hang of transitioning into the group, having a small conversation with each other, possibly assigning some roles, getting the materials that they need, and then transitioning back out so that they can practice those process and routines and set them up for success. If they aren't really strong in the routine and process of a small group, once you add in content, they're not going to be able to function and do things that you're hoping for them to be able to do. So really setting that up for success first, prior to adding in the content, is going to be key to making sure that your groups are successful. Once that happens, making sure that that assessment is ongoing and linked to the instruction. Why are they in these small groups? What information do you hope that they get while they're in that small group? And how will they prove that they've completed that work? So you're going to be able to choose whether the students are ready, making sure you add in interest and helping them to create their outcomes. Making sure that the activities that you are doing with your students are respectful activities for your students, that they're both interesting and appealing, as well as essential to understanding skills and grade level content. There should not be groups of students that are just sitting there doing repetitive things. That's going to definitely create behavior issues, and as well as making sure that your students aren't doing things that are just fluffy, right? Making sure that the reason that they're in the groups are meaningful, rather than everyone just creating a task. Helping the students to recognize the goal of why they're in those groups is going to be really successful for you. And the last one is that flexible grouping becomes part of your classroom, that students recognize that this is something that they do every day. It's not something that's just done on Fun Fridays, but that really successful small group instruction has flexible grouping throughout the day. Sometimes they're working with a teacher, sometimes they're working with different groups of students, and they're working with content that they're ready for. And so making sure that the work isn't too hard or too easy in these flexible groups is also going to definitely help make your small group successful. As we start to think about that, remember that differentiation of that instruction of what's happening in those small groups is going to be key. It's going to be crucial in why students are in these small groups. If you want them to be most successful, the work needs to be both engaging, challenging, and relevant for your students. So making sure that differentiating that instruction is going to meet your students' needs. Abby is going to dive into differentiation a little bit further, but hopefully this gave you some good thinking points for why you would want to start small groups. And now differentiation might be the key that you're looking for.
All righty. Let me make sure I'm not on mute. Okay. So from the PED's MLSS guidance document, they encourage small group instruction and they say it should be differentiated. Differentiating instruction is adjusting the instruction, not just instructional materials, based on the needs of the students. So, how do we differentiate? In order for all children to make continuous progress, differentiation strategies must occur. I'll be honest, this is the hard part, is finding ways to make activities relevant and engaging for our students. We know that teaching whole group is ineffective, but teaching in small groups is hard. So Andrea and I have some ideas for how we can make it a little bit easier for you. So, from the book, Strategies for Differentiating Instruction, Best Practices in the Classroom, the main idea is basic differentiation is concentrated on making modifications to the curriculum rather than writing curriculum that differentiates. So, being aware of all of the different district adopted curriculum, we want to try and find activities that are already at your fingertips, but give you a chance to modify that curriculum instead of going out and searching for new ideas. We would like to say start with SMART goals. Start with SMART goals about what are your students doing, why are they doing it, and for how long are they doing it. We do have some documents if you wanted to take this back or if you wanted to work on the SMART goals. It is linked in the presentation. But the questions for the participants, your students, is will they play an active role in setting their instructional goals? We have a teacher at Lowell Elementary who is starting to do this with her first graders, just with their spelling. So she's making them active participants in choosing which words the students want to go in depth during word study on and coming up with strategies for how will they improve their skills. And she has it time sensitive. Every 2 weeks, they will reassess every 2 weeks. That's part of that procedure that Andrea talked about, and just making sure students know it's predictable and they can expect of when is their next check-in. Communication is also really important when we're differentiating. Will students keep their goals in data binders or on binder rings? Just making sure whatever their learning goals are, that it's really present. I would stray away from posting it on the wall. But when I was a second grade teacher, my students would keep their goals on binder rings. And whenever they rotated to their different learning centers, they would have their learning goals with them so that if I came over to check, or if a peer came over to check, or even an administrator came over to check, the student would be able to say, I'm working on this skill, and this is my center that's going to help me with that skill. That first grade teacher, she printed them on printer paper and is just going to put them in plastic sleeves. We just want these learning goals to be as clearly communicated as possible. Another thing to consider about communication is, will the students share and report on their goals during conferences? We know conferences are coming up at the end of the month, so we could even set a goal for the next conferences that students will report on their learning goals. talk about how many goals they've completed or which goals have been particularly difficult for them. Also, we want you to think of how will guardians be made aware of instructional goals? Do your guardians of your students in your classroom know what the students are working on? I know it can be hard to communicate with parents, especially this year, but that's just a consideration to think about how are you communicating instructional goals. Now, some ways you can differentiate. You can consider differentiating by content, process, product, or learning environment. If you're already differentiating by those, you can even differentiate by multiple intelligences, getting your more artistically inclined students together, your more athletic students or introverted students, getting them to work together because they're like minded might be a great way to differentiate. So I made this chart to simplify the idea of differentiating process. Now, in the first column, and this is based off of benchmarks language, there are lessons based on students who need light support. Those might be your on level students, students who need moderate support, and our students who need substantial support. Now, on this chart, you can fill in which students need light support, moderate support, and substantial support for this particular objective. Now, in this example, I took a third grade unit where the lesson objective was to recount key story details. Reading literature 3.2. Now, I know as a classroom teacher, sometimes it's hard to differentiate materials. So in this example, all students are reading the same exact piece. Unit 4, Day 2, it's called Cinderella's Very Bad Day. I want my light support, my moderate support, and my substantial support students. I want them to all read the same thing. However, I'm going to differentiate process. So for my light support students, students will read independently. They will annotate on the text when a new event occurs. My moderate support students can read in pairs or they can listen online. Dare I say, one of the benefits of pandemic learning is now all of our students have devices. So they can listen to all of these activities online. I may have started teaching when listening to books on tape was really popular. So I kind of love the benchmark resources all being read aloud to students. So with my moderate support, they can read in pairs, which is a different process, or they can listen online. They will also annotate on the text when a new event occurs. Now, my kiddos who need substantial support, they're going to start with a picture walk. They're going to gain that context first, and then they're going to read it online, or the teacher will read it aloud to them. If the majority of my students need substantial support, it may be best to have all students reading this online. Now, I still want them to annotate on the text when a new event occurs. So, part of how I will assess how well they understood this is all students are going to create the same product. They're all going to create a 6-scene illustrated summary of the story that includes key events. It's a drawing, 6 different boxes of events that happened in Cinderella's Very Bad Day. Now, this does not have a lot of room for differentiation, but it's a small look on how I can identify which area I'm differentiating on. For this one, just differentiating for process. So thinking about this chart, Think of the materials you already have. How might you choose one area to differentiate in first? Maybe you're differentiating for the objective, the material, the process, or the product. What are you expecting students to produce? Maybe that is differentiating. As long as you're aware of what you are differentiating based off of, I think that's putting you further along the path of really differentiating instruction in your classroom. Thinking of those materials, you can differentiate with iReady lessons for the first grade teachers, the kindergarten, upcoming second. The letters manual actually has lots of activities, iStation lessons, foundation lessons, benchmark lessons. That's where I got that previous slide. Stepping stones, bridge the gap for our third, fourth, and fifth grade teachers. Or there's a link here for some word work worksheets that use the foundation lists and have different activities for students to work on. So let's talk more about activities. But I'm going to start with, what does done look like? Think about the way students will know that the process is finished. What does done look like? Andrea did mention this with the routines. Make sure you take time to train your students on what the entire activity looks like from beginning to end. If you have students coming up to you while you're in a small group saying, I'm finished, or what do I do now? That's an indicator that they don't know what done looks like. Here are some things to consider. How will students gather materials? Who can students ask for help during the activity? What does done look like for the activity? And what can they do after the activity? Slowly going through activities, maybe a whole week on if they have to read and answer. What does it look like to gather all the materials? But then what does it look like to put all the materials away? How lovely would it be that when your students are done with a small group activity, it looks perfectly clean, right? Sorry, that's my type A coming out. Keep thinking, do your students know what done looks like? I know that me as a teacher, I've been in a small group teaching, and a student will come up and say, I'm done. And I'll say, no, you're not, because I know what done looks like, but does my student know what done looks like? So, what do we do beyond the teacher led group? I'm just going to use Benchmark for an example. In Benchmark, there are so many lessons, and it gives you script. It tells you exactly what to say as the teacher leading the small group. But what do students do beyond the teacher led group? How are students working toward their instructional goals in small groups and independently? We need the rest of our students to be actively engaged in their learning goals so that we can really target those students who need substantial support. I know I would have a hard time really focusing on those students if I think other students are not actively engaged. So, one idea is to go into Benchmark and find the differentiated instructional planner. In Benchmark, the differentiated instruction planner. This is a quick video that shows you how to locate that if you don't already know. We start on Benchmark Advance. Next, you want to select your grade level. I chose grade 3. And then select a unit. I chose unit 2. Once you're here, if you scroll over to the left side, it says Differentiated Instructional Planner. Now, inside the Differentiated Instructional Planner, there's different readers that are connected to the unit: Readers Theater, Literature Circles, our ELD lessons, intervention lessons, as well as different activities that students can work on as well. One of my favorites is answering questions using text evidence. So I want to give you a moment to go ahead and visit the Differentiated Instructional Planner. At this point in the year, you might be on Unit 4. So I'll go ahead and start this again from the beginning. And if you want to navigate away from this meet, go to your Benchmark Advance, select your grade level, select your unit, and over on the left side is where you'll find the Differentiated Instructional Plan. You can see all the different leveled readers that students can read independently, read aloud, or read in small group, as well as different activities for students to engage in during the outside of teacher-led group. Now, if you're in Benchmark already, I know some of you might be logging in from your car. Let's go ahead and move forward. Sorry. Now, one activity that might be a great way to get started is the leveled textual evidence questions. Leveled textual evidence questions. Now, if you find those small readers that are connected to your unit, let's say you're in Unit 4, there are several readers that are attached to that essential question, the general theme. So if we have students reading those readers, then what? So if you're online, I wanted to show one way that you can find some activities that go along with those leveled textual evidence questions. So again, just going to start by selecting grade level and unit. Then if you scroll down, you'll see leveled text and resources. Just selecting one. Now, I'll pause here. Whoop. No, sorry. Having a hard time with this. Let me go back one. There we are. Now, if I pause, once I open up Jack and the Beanstalk, there's so many different components here that are perfect for differentiating. We do have the autoplay. If students didn't want to listen to the reading out loud, they could click on words that are unknown. But what I'd really like you to pay attention to are the teacher resources. Now, not all of the small readers have this teacher resources button up in the right corner. So there are about 10 to 12, I believe, that come with each unit. Some books do not come with any teacher resources. They're just there to add to your lesson. Now, once we're in a reader, we're going to click on Teacher Resources. And this is my favorite part. There's a teacher's guide that will give you a script and ideas for teaching with this book. There's a teacher's guide for close reading. There's a text evidence question card, and then a comprehension card. All of those are great resources for you to see in order to decide if this is the best resource for your students to work on independently. Now, if I press text evidence question card, ways to use this card. There are questions with the standard posted, the answered, and the text evidence. But what I would use is I would go to the print version. And when you scroll down to the print version, these are what you could print to prepare, cut, and have your students gather this as their material, complete the activity, and then they would turn that in as evidence. I like anything that students can turn in. That way you can use it for assessment. You can also use it for accountability to make sure your students are doing their work. Now, in a lower grade level, if we did, for example, advancing phonics, if we are having our students work on word work, there are some resources in Benchmark as well. So select grade 1, unit 2, advancing phonics skills. Your students may be at very different levels for the skills that they need to work on. So select the level your student or your small group needs. And there are also materials that can be printed up and worked on during that small group session. This doesn't have to be teacher guided. Once students are comfortable with this routine, this is something they can work on independently in a small group based on what their needs are. All right, so that was a lot of information, but Andrea is going to take over to talk about how to get this started.
All right. Now that we have the big ideas of small groups and differentiation, let's take some of these ideas and bring them to our community of learners to really help our classroom start to thrive. The first thing to consider is moving away from compliance and moving towards a community. Really making sure that we have clear expectations for our students, that they know why they're doing small groups. They're not doing small groups to make me happy. They're doing small groups to make their learning needs met. And so, really making sure that we set those clear expectations for our students will definitely start building on a community. Some students get more time with the teacher. Some students get different work to do. Some students have different timelines or outcomes. That's all okay as long as we set those expectations early and we're helping everybody recognize that we're a community of learners doing this together. The second thing to share is to model these ideas for your students. We've mentioned that setting these routines and procedures is very important for our students, helping them to understand what this looks like, what done looks like, how to be a learner in my classroom, in our community where we're working. Really modeling this for students and helping them to be able to support each other is going to be very crucial in creating that community. And the third is have a plan. What do you want your students to come away with at the end of each learning time that is meaningful both for them and for you, right? We're helping them move closer towards their goals. So, what's that plan look like? Where will they go after this step? And how will we collectively move forward? There is a great article attached to this slide that talks about kids first from day one and really helping you to visualize what compliance and community are looking like. So we're moving away from compliance and more to community where all of our learners have that voice. As we start to think about small groups, here are some of the strategies that I would share with you. Use small group time as a time to listen and learn. We don't have to be the first one jumping into the teaching, instead, letting our students share what they know, prove the learning that's happened in their small groups prior to meeting with the teacher, and allowing small groups as a possible opportunity to just share learning. That might be a great strategy to get started with as well as we're learning some of these routines that we are moving into. Offer rather than order, really allowing our students to take ownership. Again, Abby talked about them knowing their goals and how they want to progress towards those goals. So, really helping our students to make that choice for themselves, offering self-assessments for our students, as well as helping them to have some choice in that work. Adding in additional extensions of learning. So once they're in a small group, also having an opportunity for them to challenge themselves or extend their learning on their own. What do they do once they are done that continues with the learning process, but maybe might not be part of the goal outcome of that small group? Creating choices for students, offering different access to different content, and helping them to collaborate and maybe create their own challenges is going to really help success move forward into that learning community. And the last is really finding those student-driven lessons, making sure that students have an opportunity to share their expertise, to lead, as well as learn in those smaller groups. Those are all strategies that can hopefully build in some success for your community of learners. The last couple options that I can have for you is start small. Right? So we're going to create this community of learners with routines. Again, modeling those routines, starting out with smaller expectations, smaller time periods, and smaller frequency of groups is really going to help. Possibly even offering your students visual cards, task cards, so they can physically check off the activities that they're doing in those small groups. Differentiating with appropriate learning activities. Abby shared a lot of great ideas for that, making sure that it's the just right activity for your students during that time. There is nothing faster to kill small groups than activities that are either too hard or too easy for your students. So making sure that we have appropriate learning activities at all times. And number 3, this is the most important, is it takes practice. None of these routines, activities, or learning are going to happen overnight. Also recognizing that many of our students, and especially our young learners, had never had the opportunity to really get into small groups. And if they have, it's been a while. So allowing them to have some time to practice, again, with that smaller activity and that smaller time frame, so that there's not an opportunity to lose track of why we're doing these small groups. And then keep going. It's never easy day one. Small groups is something that takes a lot of practice and routine for both the teacher and the learner. So making sure that we keep going. Don't give up after day one. Problem solve with your students and find out where are those misconceptions or those things that we need to learn together as a group before we're able to move forward with small groups. But don't give up, because as we mentioned, small groups is going to be transformational for both you and your students, and will help your students meet their learning goals a whole lot faster and easier. So with that being said, we do have additional learning opportunities coming up. So if that's something that you're interested in, we do have additional literacy explorations coming. That says October, but it's actually not until February do we have another one of these learning opportunities. We do have Google Classrooms for you to participate in, as well as an ongoing PD calendar. So please join in wherever we can continue to help. And we are always happy to join and help you in any way possible. So our emails are on the slide for you. Please feel free to reach out if there's something we can help you with. You can both connect with the TLN in our newsletter, which has great tips and tricks for your classroom, as well as submit a ticket for independent one-on-one support. So we would appreciate and love to work with you in your classroom with your learners. We have a feedback here for you that we'll drop into the chat for you to get some feedback from today's session. But the rest of our time here with you today is to take any questions, clear up any misconceptions, or possibly hear any expertise that you might have when considering starting small groups in your classroom. So Abby can stop the recording. We can unmute ourselves and just share any questions that you might have. If you have no questions, thank you for being here with us today, and